right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is September 23rd, 2020, and I'm back with another Wednesday live show. And we'll take a look at the market real quick, and then we'll look at, we actually have a couple of new trades that are triggering today, and we'll take a look at those. And I haven't really marked those up yet, so do that real quick and look at the open trades. And the normal stuff. And so if anybody has any questions, they can shoot them through to me. But most of you guys have been around for quite some time, and so you know how everything works. But it's always fun to, especially a day like today where we have a couple of kind of high powered stocks triggering in. Some of the market's been pretty volatile. It's been, as they say, sort of a market of stocks. And even though there's been a relatively significant sell-off. I believe at one point yesterday the S&P was down 10% from the highs, right? Which qualifies as a correction. And of course, we know that some of the like Apple's geez, I think I saw yesterday it was down over 20%, so from its highs. And of course, CNBC likes to call that bear market territory. Yeah, let's look at that real quick. So, yeah, I had marked this line here. Of course, it had it had this crazy sort of parabolic run up and then that gap up. If you guys have seen the video on that Jeffrey made on the price volume crescendo, this gap up probably qualifies here. So, but anyway, so the funny thing about Apple is, I mean, it's had just an extraordinary run higher, right? And it's doubled since the lows. But anyway, this red line here is a 20% pullback, so it's kind of humorous to yesterday when I saw CNBC flash something across the bug on the TV screen that said, Apple's in bear market territory, right? So anything 20% off the high. So anyway, so let's take a look real quick at the S&P. Of course, we have this trend line break. That trend line break climbed back above it, broke below it. It's kind of a little bit of a caution signal. On the S&P itself, though, there's amazingly enough, it bounced right off this support zone, right? Big zone of support around those prior highs and this area here. So anyway, figure anything over 3,200, it's hanging on pretty well. And that's 100 points down, right? Over 100 points down. But, here's the thing is like these corrections. So you had kind of a leg down and a bounce, and then you had another leg down, and it's trying to work on the next bounce here. And so there's overhead resistance too, quite a bit of overhead resistance, basically way up here, right? If the market were able to put together a rally, you can see that there was a few highs up there. So anyway, right now it's kind of range bound, and it's fairly significant range too, quite honestly. Let's see, the low here was 32.29, so call it 32.30. And then, you got 34.30 practically is the high. So S&P's like kind of trapped in this big 200-point range here, and it could stay in there for a while, right? Like the low from Monday is kind of a long way down, and the highs from last week are a long way up. So a couple of hundred S&P points is fairly significant. But regardless of that, interestingly enough, as you recall, a couple weeks ago we only had one open trade, right? And that was basically after the run up, and then that first sort of pullback. We had a bunch of open trades. They all got closed when the market started selling off, and that's the key to the trailing stop, is that it's going to close the open trades when the market starts to have a little down cycle. And so we get the down cycle, and then we start to move back up, and the pending trades start triggering in slowly but surely. And so that's pretty much where we are now. So anyway, without further ado, well, let's real quick take a look at the cues just to see what's happening here. Because, of course, the NASDAQ seems to be what everybody's kind of focused on now, because obviously it's been like the huge big winner today. So clearly a trend line break there. The NASDAQ stocks are struggling. Actually, I have a watch list in my Thinkorswim. I put together just a watch list that I leave open during the day just to kind of see what's going on. It's got Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Tesla, Facebook, and Nvidia. And that's what's in my, mega cap watch list in Thinkorswim. And it's kind of cool because just sort of at a glance, I can look over there and see how those mega cap tech stocks are doing, sort of in relation to. And it's interesting because there was at some point, I don't know, I think it might have been last week or whatever, all those stocks were down, but the S&P was like just barely unchanged. But of course, the NASDAQ was down. So that gives me a pretty good little peek at the NASDAQ, which is actually acting kind of weak here today. So you can see that it had that pivot low sort of. It had a big gap down on Monday, which turned into like a pivot low reversal day, and then sort of rallied back up, and now it's this is looking a little rough here this morning, but of course that doesn't mean anything. So this red line here is a funny thing about this red line's a 20% sell off in the NASDAQ, and this green line is where it broke out to the new all-time highs. So that's kind of funny, right? Because those were the prior highs from back in February. Here was the all-time high, and it broke out of that. And then if it were to pull back to this red line, it would theoretically be in bear market territory. So real quick, let's take a look at these two new trades that are triggering today. DocuSign and Zscaler. Look at the average range on these too. These are a couple of popular high-powered stocks that both tend to really make moves, and so kind of nice, really, that and here's the thing is that regardless of what the overall market does on a day-to-day basis, we're seeing a lot of stocks that really move. And of course, one of the things, geez, years ago, and this is tough. This is tough. I should like write this down and hang it on my wall. Is best thing to do is to pretty much ignore what the market's doing or what you think it's going to do and focus on individual stock setups. And so obviously, if the market were to take a winger down here, some of the individual stock setups are going to fail. However, I've found that over the years that what the market does doesn't necessarily affect what some individual stocks do. So anyway, let's take a look at Docu here. So when I was doing the show last week, I did like this. I was doing an example of like sort of a hypothetical markup type thing about a pullback and then a low, and then the stock comes back up, and so on and so forth. And so these are the marks from last week, right? Where I was sort of just demonstrating the concept of it. So let me get rid of that. This apparently was where the trigger was last week at the time, but as you can see here, the actual trigger price came down to 207. So let's adjust that down to 207 and mark it up here. Interestingly enough, it actually triggered a little bit higher this morning. Trigger 207. So I'll put that on here. Today's open was 210.51. See, the low was 207.34. So it came pretty close to the trigger there, right? And that's not to say that, you know, in the next day or so, I mean, this could easily fade down today if the market continues to act weak, but it is what it is. It's setting up pretty well for for a move, right? It's done it a few times. Big sell off, nice bounce. Big sell off, huge move. So, and I'm sure this was earnings related. This was probably the earnings gap, and then the following day, or vice versa. But anyway, looking pretty good here. So the trailing stop, or I should say the initial stop, is down here below the lows of the pattern. So let me mark that real quick. Sometimes they're, you know, below the most recent lows. Sometimes they're not. It just depends on what the pattern looks like. So, uh, initial stop here 186. Let me mark that 186. So there we go. I guess I could put the target on here too, which is the target's 234, which is basically, you know, right in that zone there. So. And again, if let me put that on here real quick. Target 234 looks pretty reasonable. I mean, the way that this stock moves, and like I said, it's got an average range of 5.5% a day over a month's period of time. Jeffrey has an interesting way that he does the average range. I believe that he takes off, he takes the average over a whole month, takes off the biggest range day and the smallest range day, like knocks off the two sort of outliers or whatever, and arrives at a decent average. So anyway, so you know, theoretically, if you pulled the trigger first thing this morning and got filled at 210.50 or whatever, you would just raise this target a few bucks. Instead of being 234, you'd make it 237.50, which is basically, and I've started calling that the secondary target. So there's the secondary target right above there. Let's see, I'll pick a different shade of green for that. So anyway, there's a good chance and see, that's why you don't really sweat the small stuff on the entry, is because it's, I mean, it could happen, but it's kind of unlikely that it will come up and tag this target and not hit that one, but it's entirely possible. However, secondary target means that that you will achieve at least the same minimum percent as the system shows on the data table. So far so good. So decent looking pattern, right? These it's had a nice sell off and kind of bottomed out, and there's a huge sort of support zone down here right around these lows, and so you can see, even going back to here, like that's big support, and so it just bounced off support, and theoretically it's going to have to make, you can see this target's above these prior highs, so it's going to have to definitely get something going there in order to hit that. But with the market down a little bit today, it's not extremely significant, so third of a percent. Nowadays, we're seeing some activity picking up. We're seeing some 1% moves. So let's move on to this next one, ZS. There it is. ZS trigger 136.50. This one's green too. 136.50. Actually, I had this I had this somewhere on the chart, but I went ahead and just basically moved it to where it goes. So, and it opened and traded right at basically the trigger price this morning. So it's officially open. Excuse me. The stop on this is way, the initial stop anyway, is kind of way down at the bottom of this pattern. if this thing gets any forward progress today, you probably see that trailing stop ratchet up tonight. 123.50. And again, this ZS has an average range of almost 5%. So it's pretty volatile stock too. It's got a similar pattern to the last one where, well, you know, and I mean the Nasdaq itself, you know, a lot of these tech stocks had this pattern where they had sort of extraordinary run-ups, parabolic moves, and then a gap up, and then went into sell-off mode. So there it is. But yeah, this is a pretty nice looking chart. Any way you slice it, right? Nice uptrend, and you know, and the concept of, if you go to the main documentation page, you know that the main concept is that we're looking for stocks that are in a primary uptrend that have pullbacks, and then that pullback ends, and you know we get the U or the V or the, you know, there's a nice pivot low on here. So everything about this chart, there's pivot low, right? Basically sitting on this trend line, and so yeah. And so all you can do is, you know, play the individual chart patterns. And the nice thing about our system is that, you know, if the market, you know, if the market went into like, you know, a humongous sell-off and took everything with it, chances are that most of the stops, especially the longer it's open, the better off you are with the stop, because it will have trailed up. And brings me to the open trades here. So, you know, the stops trail up fairly quickly and significantly, and so we'll go through the rest of these, and we can take a look and see how they're doing. So let's see. Since we went over the first two that are triggering in this morning, we'll look at Etsy next, which is another one that I mean, Etsy's only been open for a day or so, right? I got a couple things marked on here because when we talked about this, I wanted to leave these on here too temporarily. I'm going to get rid of them right now, but we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, and the trigger price was like way up here, right? This was one of the examples I gave about when a new stock hits the trigger. And I guess it would have been a couple of Wednesdays ago, so it would have been this day right here. And this was an example of a new stock hitting the pending list with the trigger price, like, you know, way out in left field. The kind of the kind of that wouldn't make sense, although you guys that have been around for a while know how this works. And so and then so the trigger price like started off way up there at 130, right? I'll take that off. Then the trigger price came down to, like last week, I think it was at like 118.50. That was probably last week. So, you know, trigger was here. And then in between that time and then this little pivot low here, let me get rid of that. Let me get that out of there. The trigger came down to 114.25, right? And so, you know, that's basically, you know, this close right here is where it triggered in. And so I got that marked. There's the initial stop. I expect that initial stop to come up today. It's a pretty good setup. Zoom out a little bit on this. You got a really nice sell off, and then you got that pivot low, perfect sort of pivot low reversal. And then, you know, like I say, the idea is to catch it back on the way up. You know, it's kind of a funky pattern because, I mean, I sort of, my eyes have a way of sort of spotting these type of patterns, but there's a couple ways to draw this trend line. But I mean, there's a nice trend line break there, but you can see how it has a habit of having these kind of like this day right here, and what this looks like right here makes me a little bit nervous, but not a huge big deal because this has been a really strong stock, and it's got some forward progress going. So I mean, look at that. So anyway, you know, big scheme of things, I mean, this is a really nice sort of sell off, and it's attempting to break out of this flag. So there you go. Etsy not looking so bad there, right? Now it's it's basically trading right around the entry from yesterday, and so it's it could theoretically go into a little bit of a pullback here. I do expect this stop to come up today though, because there's been enough forward progress, and a couple days, well actually a day, but in theory this stop should come up, if not today, tomorrow, to probably just under the lows from Monday, Friday or Monday there. So Etsy, so far so good, basically is all I can say about that. This BAH, Booz Allen Hamilton, huh? Yeah, I think this was one I wasn't extremely fond of when we originally looked at it, just because it kind of has a habit of not doing too much. Although I say that, but it's had some pretty good swings here. This was actually a pretty nice swing, but there was a lot of just nothing happening here, and I believe the ATR on this was fairly low. So had a good day yesterday though. That was kind of nice, but this stock has spent a lot of time sort of doing nothing, so it is what it is. And moving on, this QGEN, this was another one that I didn't particularly care for, and this one, the thing of it is that we had this trade back in July that was, and the stock just basically went parabolic. You can see by that, but I kind of wasn't a big fan of this weird sort of sell-off. But amazingly enough, the last time, like in August, you can see there was a trigger here and it ran up and hit the target. And so, regardless of what I think of the chart, it could definitely work out. It just seemed like it just really dropped and then sort of recovered, and so now it's triggering in, like, right up here, triggering in this area, and the stop still. Let's see, is that stop? Yeah, 48.60. So the trailing stop hasn't moved. If it gets a push, out of this sort of range that it's in now, this trailing stop should come up. So it's a very gappy stock, and you can see it's Qiagen NV, which means it's a foreign company, and so that's why it gaps so much. So next on the list is SE. This is one that I think this SE actually was one that I think might have been one of my favorites. It's getting a little something going today here, right? It's triggered in, gapped up a little bit, kind of has been waffling around the trigger, and now, just these past couple of days here, it's starting to like push out of this little congestion area that it's been in. You can see the trailing stop starting to come up. Based on what I see right here, it'll probably come up again today, and so targets not that far away. One decent ATR, basically. The ATR, just based on what I see on the length of these bars, is basically a 1 or 1.5 ATR move to that target there. So SE looking pretty good, and I mean, you zoom back on this chart, this thing's just a monster, right? So it has a habit of busting out and really making a move. Look at that. I don't know why that got skewed, but you can sort of see what I'm talking about. When it broke out here, I mean, it just ripped higher. Had a little pullback here, and of course, that could have been an earnings gap. Earnings season was past couple of months. So anyway, this one's looking pretty good, quite honestly, and a decent little move today. But what looks good about this right now is that it's sort of breaking out of this congestion. So a little strength. Take it right up there. There's only one more, DHI, and DHI actually tagged the target yesterday. The cool thing about this DHI, DR Horton, is this was before this thing ever triggered in, like when it was back over here on the pending list, like somewhere back over here, like when it just started falling. I marked up like this sort of hypothetical example of, what just a hypothetical example of like, what the premise of this sort of trade would be. And I left those lines on there, and now you can kind of, you can kind of see the symmetry. You can see the symmetry between, this example back here of, the pullback and then the reversal through here, and then it ran up. Same thing, pulled back here, had the little sort of reversal, and then this was just, this was designed to be just sort of a parallel line, really. That's what it was. I was trying to like hypothetically show you that, first of all, when it hit the pending list, the initial trigger was probably over the high, and then it comes down, and then as time goes by, the stock bottoms out, and then meets the trigger price at a lower price. Now, ideally, if you'd had a few sideways days here, or a few sideways days, or more, more price action down around this low, then that trigger could have come down even further, and it could have gotten triggered at a lower price. But this is kind of interesting too. And so it triggered in, and you can see the initial stop was not at the pattern low this time, and that has something to do with, just the pattern altogether. So anyway, and you can see that the initial stop came up, a couple days later, and then it sat right here. This is what's interesting, is this trailing stop, the first trailing stop move happened after this sort of long range day up that came really close to the target but didn't quite make it. And then it pulled back a little bit, and this thing sat right there in that spot until like after this day. So I theoretically that should belong right there. And so conceptually, you can sort of see what's going on, right? There was only one trailing stop move, and the idea of the trailing stop is that it's designed to allow for normal price volatility based on the ATR and not knock you out on a day like this. Now, sometimes you get days like this, like this stock had on Monday, and you do get knocked out, right? I believe we had one that got knocked out on Monday. But so the cool thing about it is that the stop was hanging back, and so when it did have this sort of sort of sell off and then recovery right before the big move, and so then the next day the trailing stop moved up to just right under that low. And so, which is perfect because yesterday it tagged the target. So there you go. So that's so far this has turned into a pretty good swing trade, and amazingly enough, now look at this run right here. And so it's starting. It looks kind of similar to, if you look at this area back here. It's very similar sort of pattern. Now, is it going to run like that? I wouldn't necessarily bet on it or count on it, but if you take half off the target, follow the trailing stops, there's every possibility that that it resumes the uptrend and ends up a lot higher. And so that's sort of the idea of the whole thing, is that we don't know which ones are going to make those kind of runs, but we had a few of them recently, that were, so we had one that was over 30%. And so that's the whole idea, is like, we get it. There's the open trades looking pretty good. Nothing to really sweat. And so real quick here, I thought that there's a whole boatload of pending trades. There's so many of them that and they've been building up because the overall market's is in a sell-off mode. It's in a pullback mode, and so quite frankly, if the S&P was like one of our pending stocks, there'd be an entry probably, sort of floating down with the price. It'd probably be sitting like right there right now. So if we get some consolidation and then this turns into a big cup and we get another run, then you never know. Of course, there's a lot of stuff going on out there, but as you guys always know, it doesn't matter what I think the market's going to do or anyone thinks the market's going to do. I mean, we're headed into the election. There's going to be lots of crazy stuff. Regardless of all that, some of these individual stock setups. So, anyways, real quick, I'm gonna try and not talk your ear off about these. I just want to go through the pending trades and see what looks good. Just see what stands out. So this is a pretty decent setup right here. I like the look of this one. And it's also it's interesting. This is not really one that's been on my radar here. This has got a good looking potential setup. As you can see, it's got some work to do, but if it bottoms out here, it could easily like rally up here. So 5.7% average range. So keep that one on your radar. You can go to the pending trades and see what the trigger price on this is. This one looks like it could trigger in. Here, I'll give you this one. 1810 will trigger this thing in. So that's a beauty. I mean, because you could this is the type of stock that you see this sell off here. This just looking at the chart and see what happens is you get these sort of symmetrical patterns, but they happen a little bit differently since the price is much higher. The patterns right now is similar to that, except for it's more spread out here, and obviously with a higher price, it's gonna. But can you see the symmetry there? Like a little bit of symmetry, right? So well, hopefully, look at how this broke out on this humongous long range move. But anyway, so you get a little strength in this, you pop up here, and then next thing you know, this looks like it could rally significantly. I mean, it doesn't have to turn around and go back to the high to probably hit the target. I mean, if the target would be, and that would be a significant percentage move too. So that's a beauty. I like the look of that one. All right, real quick, I'm gonna jam through the rest of these, and then I'm gonna wrap it up. That's a pretty decent looking little pattern there. I mean, without even looking at the trigger price, I can tell you that this has got this would almost make for a decent intraday trade if you were watching this and you saw it break above this level on some volume. Chances are you could get a few bucks move right through that zone right there. So Walmart's back on the list, which is kind of boring, but it's basically Walmart's on the list because of this sort of pattern here. The huge run up here where they were getting involved with TikTok, and then it's had a little bit of a sell off. But Walmart's a pretty boring stock. PLMR is back on the list after we had a really nice trade in this thing. This might have been the one I was talking about. It was up like 30-something%, but trigger way back here, target, and then what was percentage wise, that was a huge move, and so it's kind of setting up again. It looks to me like a little more time needs to go by, but that's fine. For whatever reason, this coffee ETN, like kind of like an ETF, but big sell off there. This looks like if it drops any further, it might disappear, but at the same time, this thing has a habit of some huge zigzags, and so big sell off here and just a reversal back up. Big sell off here, and so this could turn around and reverse too. So there's some potential there, quite honestly. This NEO looks like I marked this last week, so this is still setting up. I wasn't particularly fond of the pattern because it looks kind of like a topping pattern, but sometimes, I see this so often, over the years, I've seen so many, what looks like a head and shoulders pattern turn into just a consolidation and then, it ends up moving higher. But that's just a function of how good the market's been. So, VNET, this one's still setting up, right? Microsoft's back on the list because it's had a pullback. So I'd like to see Microsoft sort of sell off more and consolidate, and then I mean, ideally, like what we're talking about here is these pending trades, right? We're talking about the pending list here. I'm just jamming down it, and so Microsoft could like chop around, do whatever, and then in the future when it's on the next upswing, then sets up again. So some time needs to go by. Same with AMD, right? Like some time needs to go by to sort of reset it. And of course, these things could all take another leg lower and set up at lower prices. So um, this thing would have to drop pretty significantly probably before it just disappeared from the list, but they will, pending trades will disappear from the list if they continue to go down. So PayPal's got a pretty decent little, after this big run up, it's got a pretty decent little pullback underway. And so if it carves out like, a bottom and then turns around, if it did something like that, like maybe it heads lower and then out in the future it goes back up and then we'll, catch it back on the way up. So just a couple more. CENTA. This one's been on the list for a period of time. This was a really good trade back here, quite frankly. I mean, it doesn't look too exciting, but you can see that basically it filled and hit the target, and trailing stop came up and all that good stuff. So that worked out pretty. I think we might have closed this one right ahead of these earnings. That was the big earnings pop, and so closed it ahead of earnings. Last but not least, GDOT, which quite frankly, it looks a little bit better now than it did last week when we looked at it. So looks to me like I just drew that line on there. Let's see the trigger. Trigger's actually a little bit lower, so, but that's interesting. But anyway, yeah, this is kind of, this one's got a 3.7% ATR on it, which is, kind of medium, but, you can spend a lot of time doing nothing. So that's something to consider. You look at, and we have, quite a few open trades and, quite a few of these pending trades. And so that's why going through them and like I just did, kind of picking and choosing which ones you think look best is the key. And so just with just real quickly with what I just went through, I'm gonna say that this is probably my favorite right now out of that whole list. I mean, there's a couple other ones that looked pretty good, but I mean, as far as like ones that are could potentially trigger, in the next, like this week or the next few days or whatever. This one I think might be my favorite. So, I don't want to. Maybe you rather wait for the AMD or Microsoft or PayPal or whatever. But so that's the idea. I mean, you got to do a little picking and choosing. So I do it by what I think I'm seeing on the pattern, and this is the one that I think has some decent potential to pop. So that's sort of the idea, right? So anyway, and I mean, here's the thing about this one is with this trigger down here, even if it just rallies up to, even if it were to just like rally right up to there. I mean, it's pretty good, pretty good potential there to break out of this and make a decent move back towards $20. So let's leave that on there, and we'll come back next week and see if it triggered and what it looks like. So anyway, quick show today, just kind of jammed through everything and looked at quite a few stocks. So I encourage you to go through and analyze them a little bit more closely than I did and see what you think. So anyhow, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you guys back here next week, same time.